Hello, I'm April and welcome to the Grant Template series of videos, presenting the grant project as a solution. So the goal here is to connect the solution that we present as the project in the grant to the problem statement that we are making in the narrative. This relates directly to the previous video in this series about the problem statement, and I highly recommend that you can watch that video before this one to better grasp the content of this video. The idea is that all activities will be directly justified by the problem statement, and therefore all evidence that you bring into the narrative serves to support the connection between the activities you're proposing and the problem. This is important because it's very easy to get carried away and sidetracked and start talking about different kinds of evidence and different things that are happening that are not really connected to your activities directly. So you can sometimes summarize the focus points that you're going for by thinking about your activities. What am I actually doing in the grant? And that can be a gauge for you to make it more succinct, make your narrative more objective. So it's also okay to repeat a little bit, to be a little repetitive throughout the narrative, reminding reviewers of the connections to the problem. Some interesting points when it comes to presenting the narrative, presenting that solution, is to have a lot of structure, clarity, and logical sense in the narrative document itself. Structure really speaks to this idea of the order of the information that we're displaying. For example, new paragraphs for each new point that we are making, having clear headers and subheaders. It's perfectly okay to have many headers and subheaders in grants. When it comes to clarity, the idea is usually around less is more. So make your point and don't over-explain how the evidence came to be. What that means is that if you're trying to make a point about why students are getting low grades, you can stay very close to that point, meaning, oh, the students are getting low grade because of this, and here's the evidence. You don't have to explain where that study that produced the evidence came from, how they performed their study, all those kinds of things, unless it directly relates to the work that you're doing in this project. So if you're developing on what they did, then yes, what they did is relevant. Otherwise, you can just bring their findings very succinctly and just make your point. Prioritize the hook of the argument earlier in the paragraphs and the structure of the grant. This is a suggestion, of course, but it can really help the reader to get what you're talking about really quickly into the process and then go through your elaborations already knowing what you are talking about. It's better than having a very, very long introduction or story to then later make this final point at the end of a paragraph or a sentence or a page. So try to make your points early and then elaborate. Avoid sharing unnecessary information. This is a really key point in grants. Reviewers don't have infinite time to look at your grant, so less is more. Logical sense means building up from simple to complex. The idea is to start simple, get that problem point out there clearly and easily understood by reviewers, and then you can start elaborating more and telling them about other aspects that might help them grasp reasoning behind your activities and why your grant needs to be funded. However, always keep in mind, less is more. And give a clear overview of the object, of the entire object, before going into details of that object. For example, if your project has 4 phases, you can clearly show that at the beginning of your narrative. This project has 4 phases. This is what it is. This is, and a brief, couple of words about phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then later you elaborate. This is phase 1, this is phase 2, this is phase 3. I have seen a lot of grant proposals where they are presenting a problem and then they simply start talking about in phase one, and you as a reader have no idea how many phases the project has, where it's going. So for the reader, it becomes really difficult to follow what the scope of the grant is and what the scope of the project is when certain views of the entire object are not presented early on, so the reviewer can establish that schema in their mind as well and follow what the grant is telling them. So here's one example of this idea of the hook first or the hook at the end. Let's just say this is a project that is focusing on the low grades of students, and it's going to implement a program or something that is going to help students, first-gen students, to improve their grades. That's the goal of this project. So with the hook first, you bring in that information that 78% of first-generation students report low grades. And then you go about the rest of the reasoning associated with course choices, dissatisfaction with course choices, and then you elaborate even further. Advisors attribute to this and this and that, and you might get into a few other points that might be related to what you're doing in your activities. And it might be better to do it that way than the opposite way. And I'll suggest pausing the screen if you want to read the whole thing. But with the hook on the end, you would start talking about the advisors. They report a series of problems. Here are those problems. And then at the very end of the paragraph, you might say, it is possible that this may tie to 78% of the first generation students. And that is your point. By the time the reader gets to that part of your paragraph, the reader might be confused if your project is really focusing on the students or if it's really focusing on the advisors. They might think you are implementing a new program for advisors, so it becomes more confusing. In my view, of course, this is just a suggestion, but the idea is that you can think through your text based on the point and the goals of your project. So keeping that very clear will help reviewers also follow what you're doing and support the activities that you're proposing. So some guiding points that we can look at as well, the idea of scope and potential of the grant. Here, the idea is that early on, you can make it clear what is the scope of your project and what is the potential. The scope can mean everything from the period of performance, how long is the project, to how many participants are involved, how much data, how many activities. You can give reviewers a clear idea of that early on. And the second point is the potential. In many cases, proposers forget to talk about the future and the potential and the deliverables and the outcomes of the grant. And maybe that can be related to traditional research where it's prudent to not go there too much, right? Like we perform a research study, here's my findings, I have some ideas for future studies, end of story, goodbye. But when it comes to grants, the idea is that you can have a long-term vision for that work. And that long-term vision interests sponsors and interests reviewers. And it means a lot not only to the future of the work, but to your intentions as an agent that is proposing a solution in that field, in that work development. So it's good in grants if reviewers and sponsors see you as someone positively ambitious, someone that wants to solve the problem and wants to keep going and is determined to promote more and more solutions and promote expanded awareness of the problem, etc. So this idea of talking about the potential and working through the potential of your project is really important when presenting your solution, because it talks about sort of like the longevity of the solution you're proposing, how far into the future your project can go. Many projects can take a life of their own. After the period of funding ends, they can find other funding mechanisms and keep going. All those things are very important for reviewers to know early on so that they can be for example, more optimistic about all the activities you're proposing and, of course, about giving you the funds. Some other points that we can think of is constantly reinforcing why the project is a good solution. So along the narrative, keep reminding the reader of why. So for example, when presenting evidence, you can say, following evidence related to the problem, this activity supports XYZ construct or a certain specific component that you're working on, but keep mentioning the problem along the way. Be clear about the grade of innovation in your propositions. This is really important. We do not have to reinvent the wheel, create the most astonishing invention ever in our grants, not at all. But it's important for reviewers and sponsors to understand what exactly in our grants we consider an innovation, because that will be a point where reviewers will look to either give you points or subtract points from their review if they find that you're saying something is innovative and it's not. And so it's really important in this case that you can be the one who tells the reviewer and the sponsor what is innovative. Because the moment you set those boundaries, you say, hey, I'm doing something that everyone has done, but I'm doing it with this population. This is the innovative point in my grant. The point that is innovative is exclusively the fact that I'm working with this population. So what happens when you establish that is that all the reviewers can do is argue with you in terms of, is it innovative to that population, yes or no? The rest of the activities, you are already clearly establishing that they are not innovative, so reviewers will not start looking at your activities and looking for that criteria of being innovative or not. So if you don't do that, if you don't establish what is innovative, don't establish those boundaries of, hey, this is what it's innovative, then reviewers will look for innovation everywhere in your proposal. And then they will start subtracting points from every aspect of your proposal, and they'll just say, oh, this is not new, this isn't new, this is not new, because they haven't found that argument that you would have made about what exactly is innovative. So this idea of innovation is important because you, as the grant proposer, must take control over the narrative and over what is innovative in your project. This is really important. Another idea is to keep feasibility in mind. This is another really important low-hanging fruit that reviewers love to pick on. They love to look at a project and say, that's not feasible. They don't have enough time. They don't have enough personnel. There's not enough funds for that. That's like the core of reviewer work, right? I think if you have reviewed, you probably have done that, where you're looking for, an easy sort of low-hanging fruit to subtract points from the project. So it's important that you as a proposer can have that in mind, anticipate that process that the reviewers will go through anyway, and try to be very clear about the feasibility and about why it's feasible. You can justify that, for example, with past experiences that you may have or someone in your team may have, or you can justify that with letters of support, letters of commitment, or other ways to justify why your project is feasible the way you are proposing it. And then finally, be very clear about future possibilities. This ties to this idea that we were talking about of disclosing the potential and articulating the potential. And the idea is that when you do that, try to be as precise as possible. Try to bring in a very clear idea of how exactly that future looks like. Is it something you're going to work on, for example, online? Are you going to have some online webinars every couple of months where you're going to bring the community together around the findings? Are you going to go through conferences and write papers, publish a book? Is there another study that you're looking at in the future with some other partners? Be very clear about your ideas of the future, and that will likely stimulate the reviewers and motivate them to continue reading and be hopefully excited about what you are proposing. And then finally, and we're getting at the end of this presentation, but the idea is to think about the reviewer themselves. This is really important because the reviewer is a person just like us, and they have this work of reviewing your proposal. So imagine yourself as a reviewer first. This exercise can be done, for example, by reading out loud what you have written, and maybe sometimes putting your PDF into one of those automated AI readers and let the computer read it back to you, because you don't want to have a friend do that, because they'll be upset with you if you ask them to do that. But have one of those automated readers read it back to you, leave the proposal aside, come back to it after 5 days, look at it with fresh eyes. Those are exercises that can help you put yourself in the position of a reviewer. Then start imagining reviewer characteristics and traits, like, for example, a very distracted reviewer. Imagine the most distracted person that you know. Okay, that's your reviewer. What can you do in your narrative to make sure that even a super distracted reviewer will still get the main points that you're mentioning? We're going to look more into details of how to really build the narrative and how to build the timeline in future videos in these series. So here's just this core idea of, when presenting a solution, make sure that that message, which is your solution, gets to the receiver of that message, which is the reviewer, in its full form, right? We all know from communication theory that there is distortion along the way, right? After a message is sent and until it is received, plus all the perceptions in the reviewers' minds themselves and their prior knowledge and their capabilities to even understand the terminology. All of that kind of thing must be something you have in mind when proposing your solution, when thinking about it, when writing, when making it very clear, and so forth. Imagine a reviewer that is self-centered and hyper-thorough, going through every little detail of your grant and checking all the references. You will bump into some of those. So what will they say when they see your proposal? Just think about that. How easy is it for them to understand your proposal? Does your proposal give them what they need? Now, this is a little different from the idea of pleasing the reviewer or getting the message through. It's a little different. The idea here is, does it clearly answer to the solicitation requirements and the requirements that that reviewer has in relation to the sponsor? It's important to think of the reviewer as someone that is almost employed, even though they don't have that contract typically, but it's almost like someone that is employed by the sponsor to do a job. So they will have guidelines that the sponsor is giving them to look at your proposal, following those guidelines. So it's important that you can anticipate that and make sure that you're checking all the boxes. Usually, reviewer guidelines can be found through the narrative, solicitation documents, sometimes in the sponsor website and in the other sponsor documentation. You will find the clear sort of training that they give to reviewers and what reviewers will have in mind when they come to your proposal. And many solicitations will literally have a list of expectations in the form of headers and subheaders that they are giving to you in the solicitation itself. It's perfectly okay to copy those headers and subheaders and move them into your narrative and just elaborate on your narrative under the exact same headers and subheaders that the sponsor put out in the narrative. It's perfectly okay to do that. It's actually recommended. I have seen many funded projects that do exactly that. And that's very good because it's easy for reviewers to look at the narrative and quickly check those boxes. Does this proposal include this? Does this proposal include that? Are they talking about this? Are they bringing evidence towards that? and they can check all those boxes very easily, and they will love your proposal for that. So think about that and give reviewers what they need. Then, in a more inspirational ending here to our video, if you are asked, how did you convince the reviewers? What would be your answer? So what is it about your project that you think is going to get the reviewers, or is going to get them to give you more points than your competing projects? What is it? Is it your idea? Is it the population? Is it the activities, the way you articulate it? Is it the methods? Is it the team you're bringing in? Is it a little bit of all of that? Just think about it and think about how you would answer that question of how did you convince the reviewers? And then finally, what about your proposal might get reviewers very enthusiastic? And this is taking things up a notch and thinking about what could make reviewers finish reading your proposal and feel so excited that they want to share with the next person. So they're, maybe they can't because of their reviewer agreement, but they are really excited and they're hoping that soon they can start talking about it. And, oh my God, I reviewed a proposal. It was great because of this or because of that. What are those things that you think might really get reviewers to that level of enthusiasm? So these are things that are important to think about when shaping the solution that you present as your project in a grant. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it gives you some ideas for your narrative. We're going to go into a lot more detail in this series on how to explore the grant narrative and create a really strong competitive proposal. So stick around, and thank you for now. See you in the next video.